A forgotten cemetery at the edge of town hides secrets buried deep in the earth. What happens when the dead are more than just silent memories? From the cursed voices that call from the grave to a mansion built on the stories of lost souls, these 10 spine-chilling tales will take you on a terrifying journey through haunted grounds, time loops, and ghostly encounters. But be warned, once you step into these graveyards, the past may just come to life, and you might not be able to leave. Welcome to a collection of eerie tales where the dead aren't as silent as we'd like to think. From forgotten graveyards to haunted manors, the stories within these pages, or rather this video, are filled with chilling encounters that blur the line between the living and the dead. Imagine this: a cemetery caretaker inherits a manor, where each room represents a different death, a house that feeds on grief, and the souls of the departed trapped in its halls. Or a seemingly innocent tombstone that's stolen as a prank, only to turn deadly as the inscribed epitaph starts rewriting the fates of those around it. As the heavy rains fall, the spirits that linger in a graveyard built on an ancient well begin to call out for their lost loved ones. They're not spirits, though. They're something worse, feeding on grief, dragging their victims into a watery abyss. And then there's the manor, a place that doesn't just house the dead, but holds their final moments, pulling anyone who dares to step inside into the reenactment of their tragic fates. These 10 stories aren't just about death. They're about what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. They'll draw you into their mysteries, with twists that will make you question the very ground beneath your feet. Are you ready to enter these cursed places? To face what's been left behind? Story number 1. In the small, quiet town of Darlow Hollow, there was a cemetery no one really talked about. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time, like something tucked away in the back of your mind, just out of sight, but never really gone. It had been there for centuries, nestled between the woods and the outskirts of town, the kind of cemetery where the stones seemed older than the town itself. The grass grew high and wild, and the air always felt a little too still. There were only a few people who ever went there, and none of them stayed long. One of those people was Luther Graves. Luther was the gravedigger, but he wasn't the kind of gravedigger you'd expect. He was different. He had a way about him, a peculiar kind of cheerfulness, especially for someone who spent his days in a place where death seemed to linger in the air. He was always whistling or humming some old tune, wiping his brow as he shoveled dirt into graves. And his smile, God, that smile. It was wide and almost unnerving, like someone who was too content with their work. But no one questioned it. After all, he was just the gravedigger. Mandy Clark had just turned 17. She wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or old superstitions, but there was something about Darlow Hollow that gave her a strange sense of curiosity. When the summer arrived and she found herself looking for a job, the cemetery seemed like a quiet place to work, away from the noise of town. She didn't expect much, just a simple summer gig. But the moment she stepped foot in that graveyard, she felt something change, something she couldn't explain. Luther welcomed her with open arms, his eyes twinkling as if he were a man who'd found his perfect assistant. She didn't know why he'd chosen her, of all people. Maybe it was because her father had been a carpenter, someone who'd worked with wood and built coffins for the town. Maybe it was because her mother had always had that strange, almost religious, connection to the cemetery, always whispering under her breath when they drove past it. But whatever it was, Luther had taken an immediate interest in her, and soon Mandy was spending her days with him, helping with the mundane tasks of preparing graves and clearing weeds. It didn't take long before Mandy started to notice something strange. Every night when she'd come back to check on the cemetery after her shift, the graves were always open. The freshly dug dirt would be disturbed and the coffins empty. She thought maybe it was an animal at first, but when she began to investigate further, she realized something darker was at play. One night, as she crept through the cemetery, Mandy saw it with her own eyes. The bodies were rising. They came out of their graves like clockwork, each of them moving in silence, their eyes hollow, their faces pale and blank. They didn't stumble or groan like the zombies you see in movies. No, these corpses were different. They walked with purpose, with intent, as if they had never died at all, and they moved under Luther's command. Mandy's heart raced as she watched from the shadows. Luther stood in the center of the cemetery, his back straight, his hands raised to the sky. He whispered something under his breath, something ancient and foreign, and the dead obeyed. It was a ritual, a dark, twisted ritual that Mandy couldn't begin to understand. But one thing was clear. Luther wasn't just the gravedigger. He was a master. And those bodies? They were his servants. When Mandy confronted him, demanding answers, Luther only smiled. That same, unsettling smile. "You've figured it out, haven't you?" he said, his voice almost sweet, like a grandfather telling a child a secret. "But you see, my dear, I've been doing this for a long time. Longer than you could ever imagine. This cemetery, it's mine. And these bodies, they keep me alive. They keep me young." Mandy's mind spun as Luther explained. He wasn't human, not really. He was something much older, something that had been using the cemetery for centuries to feed off the souls of the dead. Every time someone was buried, their body was used, in a ritual to preserve Luther's youth. The bodies would rise each night, serving him, working for him, keeping him alive long after he should have been dust. And Mandy? She had been chosen, not by accident, but because she was a direct descendant of the original founder of the cemetery. Her bloodline made her essential to his plan. The realization hit Mandy like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just a worker here. She was part of the ritual, part of the trap. The blood running through her veins made her the key to keeping Luther alive for centuries to come. Father Thomas had warned her, but she hadn't listened. He'd tried to tell her that the cemetery was cursed, that no one who worked there had ever left the same way they came. But she hadn't understood. Now it was too late. The dead were already waking. Mandy knew she had to do something, but what? She couldn't just leave. Luther wouldn't let her. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that there was only one way to stop him. She had to destroy the totem, the dark symbol that anchored the ritual and kept the dead bound to Luther's will. In the dead of night, Mandy snuck into the cemetery, armed with only a crowbar and a hammer. She found the totem, buried deep beneath an ancient oak tree, its roots wrapped around the twisted symbol of death. With every ounce of strength she had, she smashed it. The earth shook, the sky darkened, and the dead began to scream. Luther appeared, his eyes wild with fury, his smile gone. "No, you don't understand. You can't." But it was too late. The cemetery was collapsing in on itself. Flames erupted from the ground, and the trees caught fire as the dead writhed and burned in the chaos. As Mandy watched the cemetery crumble, she thought she saw Luther standing amidst the inferno, his eyes locked on her. He smiled, and then he vanished. The fire burned for hours, consuming everything in its path. By morning, the cemetery was nothing but ashes, and the town of Darlow Hollow would never be the same. But as Mandy stood before the ruins, she noticed something. A carved smile in the bark of the ancient oak tree. It was Luther's smile, still there, even after everything had burned to the ground, and somehow Mandy knew. He'd be back. He always came back. Story number 2. Lucas Hale had never been one to believe in ghosts. He was a writer after all, a man who lived in his head more than he did in the world around him. But after years of battling writer's block and struggling to make ends meet, he was desperate. Desperate for peace. Desperate for inspiration. So, when the chance came to rent a small secluded cottage in the town of Ashwood Hollow, he jumped at it. The cottage was nestled on the edge of a forgotten graveyard, an old, overgrown plot of land that seemed to have been left behind by time. There were only a few visitors, mostly old-timers who would wander through the gates in the morning, lay flowers, and then disappear by sundown. Lucas didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what he needed. The first night was uneventful. Just the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. But by the second night, things began to change. It started as a faint whisper, low and almost inaudible, like a breeze brushing past his ear. At first, Lucas thought it was just the wind, or maybe the trees creaking in the distance. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and they were coming from the graveyard. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the isolation playing tricks on his mind. But it was hard to deny the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to notice. Then, one night, as he sat at his desk, pen in hand, a voice, clear and distinct, whispered from the darkness, "Write our story." Lucas froze, his heart racing. The voice wasn't his own thoughts. It was outside him, coming from the graveyard. He got up and peered out the window, but all he saw was the faint outline of headstones in the moonlight. For a long moment he stood there, his breath shallow, the air thick with unease. Finally, he turned back to his desk. He had nothing else to do. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the pressure of needing something, anything, to write. The next morning, he visited the graveyard. The air around the graves was thick with history. The stones were old, worn down by time and weather, and some of them were so cracked and eroded they barely had names left. But when Lucas looked at them, something strange happened. He felt as if each one was looking back at him. He shook it off. It was just a graveyard after all. Nothing more than a patch of land where people had been buried. But that night, the whispers returned. Louder this time. Urgent. Write. Write our story. This time, Lucas couldn't ignore them. Sat at his desk, picked up his pen, and began to write. At first, the words came easily. The voices guided him, telling him their stories, tales of betrayal, murder, and loss. Each story was worse than the last. Each soul had suffered in ways Lucas could barely comprehend. And the more he wrote, the stronger the voices became. The whispers grew into something more, a chorus of rage and desperation. The spirits weren't just telling their stories anymore. They were demanding something from him. That was when he realized he wasn't just writing about their deaths. He was reenacting them. Every word he wrote seemed to bring the deaths to life, pulling the spirits out of the graves, feeding them. Lucas began to feel their anger, their suffering. He couldn't stop. He couldn't tear himself away. The more he wrote, the more he became consumed by it. And then, one night, something changed. Mina, the bartender from the local tavern, had warned him about the graveyard. She told him there were stories about it. Stories that no one spoke aloud. She said the graves had a way of reaching out to people, pulling them in, using them. But Lucas had been too caught up in his writing to listen. Now, he wished he had. "You're not just writing their stories, Lucas," Mina said one evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit bar. "You're becoming them. The spirits, they're not just asking for you to write. They're using you. You're recreating their deaths." Lucas laughed at first. It sounded ridiculous, but as the days passed, the whispers grew stronger, and he began to feel it himself. He was trapped. There was no escape. The spirits were in control now, using him like a puppet to act out their violent, vengeful stories. His editor, Paul, had been pushing him hard for the past few weeks. He could tell Lucas was writing more than ever, but something about the work seemed wrong. Paul read the manuscript, his face turning pale as he flipped through the pages. "Lucas," Paul said, his voice shaking, "what the hell is this? This isn't a novel. It's a record of murders, real murders. What have you gotten yourself into?" But Lucas couldn't stop. The words kept flowing, like a river he couldn't dam. The spirits demanded vengeance, and he was powerless to deny them. Each night the voices grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just telling their stories anymore. They were commanding him to finish what they had started, to complete the cycle. Then, one night, as Lucas typed the final words of his manuscript, something changed. The room grew cold. The air thickened. And then, as he stared at the screen, the whispers turned into screams. He tried to stop, to push away from the desk, but it was too late. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, and before he could even scream, he was dragged out of his chair, dragged out of the house, and pulled toward the graveyard. The spirits were waiting for him. They dragged him into an open grave, their cold, skeletal hands tearing at him as they pulled him down into the earth. His screams echoed through the night as the grave swallowed him whole. Lucas Hale was never seen again. Months later, his manuscript was discovered, left behind on his desk. It was a grotesque, disturbing account of the spirits' stories. Stories of murder and vengeance. And it was published against all advice. But those who read it quickly went mad, unable to cope with the horrors written within its pages. Some said it was cursed, others that it had a life of its own, feeding off the minds of anyone who dared to read it. And the whispers. They never stopped. They still echo from the graveyard at night. Write our story. Story number 3. Claire. Monroe never thought a visit to her grandmother's rural home would turn her world upside down. But when she arrived in the small sleepy town of Hallow Ridge, something felt off. The air was thick with the kind of quiet that settled deep into your bones, and the house, her grandmother Elsie's house, looked the same as it always had. It was a cozy, old thing, with peeling paint and flower beds that had seen better days. Nothing special. Nothing that would have prepared her for what she was about to uncover. It was late afternoon when Claire noticed the grave in the backyard. It was small, barely more than a simple mound of dirt, tucked in a far corner near the fence. It had no headstone, just a faded marker that read, "Baby Unknown." Claire stood there for a long time, staring at it, confused. It was odd, even, for this place. Her grandmother had never mentioned a baby. She'd never mentioned a grave. "Grandma," Claire called, turning toward the house. Elsie appeared in the doorway, her frail figure framed by the dark interior. "What is it, honey?" Grandma's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something Claire couldn't quite place. "Who's buried here?" Claire asked, pointing at the little grave. Grandma's face tightened, her eyes flickering with something like fear. "It's nothing. Just a mistake from the past. Don't you worry about it." Claire could tell by the way her grandmother spoke that it wasn't just nothing. There was a story there, but she didn't press her. Not yet. That night, as Claire settled into the old guest room upstairs, she tried to ignore the strange feeling that clung to the air. The house creaked and groaned as the wind picked up outside. But in the stillness of the night, Claire heard something, a faint, unsettling sound. A cry. It was soft, almost like a baby, muffled by the walls. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, or maybe the old house making noise. But then she heard it again, and again. The cries were unmistakable. A baby crying in the night. Claire's heart raced, and she pulled the covers up tighter around her. She thought about the grave. The baby unknown. The next morning, Claire decided to ask her grandmother about it again. "Grandma, I heard something last night," Claire said over breakfast, trying to keep her voice casual. "It sounded like a baby crying. Is there a baby's grave out back?" Grandma's hand trembled as she set down her coffee cup. Her eyes narrowed, and Claire saw the familiar look of fear in them again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Guilt. "I told you, Claire, it's nothing. Forget it." But Claire couldn't forget. The cries had been too real, too desperate. That afternoon, she took a walk by the grave, feeling drawn to it as if the earth itself were calling her closer. She knelt by the marker, tracing the faded letters with her fingers. Baby unknown. That was all it said. Nothing else, no dates, no name, just a sad, nameless thing buried in secret. The cries came again that night. This time they were louder, closer. Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. She walked down the narrow hallway toward the source of the sound. The cries seemed to be coming from the old attic, a place Claire had never been. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. She stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat, and that's when she saw it. A small child, no more than a few years old, stood at the far end of the attic. It was a faceless figure, its head a smooth, featureless mass. It was staring at her with empty eyes, its tiny hands reaching out toward her. The cries were coming from it. Claire froze, heart pounding in her chest. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The child stepped closer, its footsteps light and almost floating, as though it didn't belong in the world of the living. And then, in a voice that was too old for such a small thing, it whispered, "Name me." Claire felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. The air seemed to close in around her, thick with something that smelled like rot, like death. "Name me," the child repeated, its voice echoing in her mind. "Before I'm whole." A deep sense of dread filled Claire's chest. She wanted to run, to scream, but her feet were glued to the floor. She couldn't look away from the child, this thing that wasn't quite a child, that was so far from human that it made her stomach twist. I don't understand," Claire whispered. The child took another step forward, its faceless head tilting as though curious about her response. "You must name me. I will not rest until you do." Claire's mind raced. She thought about the grave, the baby unknown. Was this the same child? The same spirit that had been buried in secret? Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Don't worry about it. But Claire couldn't forget. She couldn't leave it unnamed. In a panic, she closed her eyes and reached deep into her memories, trying to find something, anything, that might fit. A name. She didn't know why, but the name Eli came to her. It felt right, like it belonged. "I name you Eli," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. The moment she spoke the name, the child's form flickered, becoming sharper, more solid, its shape becoming clearer. It still had no face, but now Claire could see it. Its small, pale hands, its ragged clothes, its eyes. And though she couldn't see its face, she felt its gaze on her, cold and hollow. The cries stopped. Eli was no longer a nameless, faceless thing. He was whole. And yet, something felt wrong. The child, if it could still be called that, stared at Claire with an unsettling, knowing expression, as if it were studying her. "You shouldn't have done that," the child said, its voice now strange and twisted. It was still young, but its tone was full of malice, of something ancient and broken. Before Claire could react, the child's form shifted, contorting and growing, stretching into something grotesque, something that looked too much like her. It was her face, her eyes, but wrong, twisted. The thing that had once been Eli now wore her features, its body contorted into a grotesque mimic of her own. The thing smiled, her smile, and then it turned, disappearing into the shadows of the attic. The last thing Claire heard was the rustling of the woods outside. She ran, heart pounding in her chest, but by the time she reached the back door, the figure was already gone. Into the woods, into the dark. The next day, Claire's grandmother was gone, vanished. No one knew where she went. The only thing left was the grave, now disturbingly quiet. Claire never spoke of what happened, but that night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear the whispers of the baby, still begging her name. And in the woods, something moved. Story number 4. Dr. Evelyn Bright wasn't one to shy away from danger. As an archaeologist, she had spent her life digging through history's layers, uncovering long-forgotten relics and ancient secrets. But when her team discovered the hidden tomb beneath the colonial cemetery, something felt different, something wrong. It started as a simple excavation, just another dig to add to her career's long list of accomplishments. The cemetery had been there for centuries, nestled on the outskirts of the small town of Halstead, and no one had ever thought much of it. But when Evelyn and her team's tools hit something solid below the old graves, they knew they had stumbled onto something extraordinary. The tomb wasn't colonial. It was far older, too old. Beneath the rotting grave markers, they found a stone structure, intricately carved and unlike anything they'd ever seen. The markings weren't human, and neither were the symbols. They didn't match any civilization they had studied. The tomb was pre-human, possibly even alien. At first, the excitement was palpable. Evelyn, along with her team, Jamal, her quick-witted assistant, Claire, a rival archaeologist turned reluctant ally, and a few others, had no idea what they were about to uncover. But the deeper they went into the tomb, the more they realized that whatever lay ahead was not just a relic of the past. It was something alive, something waiting. As they descended into the catacombs, the air grew thick, oppressive, and the walls seemed to shift. The tunnels twisted in ways that defied logic, as if they were changing to accommodate something that was watching them. They pressed on, each of them driven by their own reasons, their own buried guilt. Jamal, normally the life of the group, was the first to notice something strange. It started with whispers, low, almost imperceptible, like the soft rustling of leaves. But the whispers weren't coming from any of them. They came from the shadows. Claire brushed it off. "You're just tired. It's the pressure getting to you." But the shadows, they were moving, like living things. And that's when the floor beneath them began to shift. At first, it was subtle. The walls seemed to close in on them just a little bit until it felt like they were being funneled into a narrower path. But then the whispers grew louder and darker. And something else started to grow. Something from the depths of the tomb. Shadows twisted and stretched like fingers, reaching for them, crawling along the walls, feeding on the air. Evelyn's heart pounded as she tried to maintain her composure. There was a rational explanation. There had to be. But she knew deep down that something far more sinister was at play. Something ancient. Something hungry. "Stay close," Evelyn ordered, trying to take charge. "We need to get back to the surface. Now!" But the catacombs wouldn't let them. The paths shifted, their direction twisting, never leading them toward the exit. It was like the tomb itself was alive and aware. "Something's wrong," Jamal muttered, his voice shaky. We shouldn't have come this deep." Evelyn pushed forward, determined to find a way out. But the tomb wasn't just playing tricks on their senses. It was tapping into something deeper, something far more insidious. It was feeding on their guilt, their regrets, their secrets. The deeper they went, the more twisted and distorted their surroundings became. The shadows didn't just move anymore. They took form, the depthless ones. Dark figures that were the embodiment of their buried guilt, their unspoken fears. They were the ghosts of their pasts, and they were hungry. Jamal was the first to break. The figures started to take the shape of things he couldn't outrun. Faces he'd wronged in the past, people he had abandoned, all stretching out from the shadows, their voices rising in accusing whispers. "You left us. You ran away!" Jamal screamed, a raw, guttural cry. "No, stop!" He swung his arms, desperate to push the shadows away, but they just kept coming. One by one, the figures crawled up his legs, his arms, pulling him into the blackness. He begged, pleaded, but the darkness smothered him, pulling him deeper and deeper into its cold, empty embrace. Evelyn, horrified, reached for him, but the catacomb shifted again, blocking her path. The shadows tightened, forming a wall, a barrier that kept them from reaching him. Jamal's cries became muffled, and then there was silence. It felt like an eternity before she could move again, but by the time she did, all that remained was a deep, unnatural stillness. Claire, usually the skeptic, was pale, shaking. What the hell was that? What happened to Jamal? Evelyn's breath was heavy. It's the tomb. It's feeding on us. The depthless ones had been awakened, and they were hunting their deepest, darkest regrets. The more Evelyn thought about it, the more she realized. Each of them had been drawn here because of something they were hiding, something they hadn't dealt with. But they couldn't escape, not unless they faced their own shadows. Claire's face twisted with fear, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" Evelyn shook her head. "We need to find a way to confront them. Our guilt, our regrets. It's the only way." But before they could act, the tomb responded. The walls trembled as the air became thick with pressure. Evelyn felt something tugging at her, whispering her own secrets to her, dredging up the painful memories she'd buried for years. Her failed marriage, the betrayal of a close friend, a decision she had made years ago that had ruined someone else's life. But the shadows were becoming stronger, darker. The depthless ones had begun to feed on their guilt, their regrets, and now they were too strong to fight back. In a desperate panic, Evelyn turned to Claire. "We need to destroy it. The tomb. It's feeding on us." Claire looked at her, fear clouding her eyes. "How?" "I don't know," Evelyn shouted. "But we have to do something." But before they could act, the walls closed in. The shadows took form again, engulfing Claire and Evelyn, dragging them down into the abyss. The tomb had claimed them. When the rescuers arrived, the catacombs were silent. The earth had sealed itself, hiding the tomb, hiding the horrors beneath the surface. Only one member of the team had made it out alive, barely. He was found weeks later, rambling in the woods, skin covered in strange carvings. Maps, trails, notes. His mind was broken, consumed by what he had seen. All he could whisper over and over was, "We were never meant to dig this deep." Story number 5. Danica Reyes didn't believe in ghosts, or at least she hadn't. She was a skeptic at heart, an adventurous, thrill-seeking paranormal vlogger who lived for the rush of debunking the supernatural. And that's exactly what had led her to Cemetery Row. It was just another obscure graveyard, tucked away at the edge of the sleepy town of Dunwich. A relic from a time long forgotten, the tombstones worn down by years of weather and neglect. Most locals didn't even remember it existed. But Danica had heard the stories, whispers of strange happenings, rumors of tombstones that moved at night. Of course, no one could prove it. So, Danica figured it was worth a look. Armed with her camera, she set out to film a vlog. Her best friend, Leon, was with her, though he wasn't nearly as eager. He was the practical one, the skeptic who always had his doubts, even about Danica's most convincing ghost hunting stunts. "Do you really think the tombstones move? Or are we just feeding into some creepy urban legend?" Leon asked, his arms crossed as they walked between the rows of crumbling graves. "I don't know," Danica said, raising the camera to capture the scene. "But I'm here to find out. People say things happen here at 3:03 a.m., like clockwork. If we catch it on camera, we'll have the proof." Leon scoffed. "I'll believe it when I see it. And I mean see it, not just some blurry footage." The night dragged on slowly, filled with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The only light came from the pale glow of Danica's flashlight and the moon overhead. The cemetery was quiet, too quiet. But Danica's curiosity kept her focused. She set up her camera, watching the clock on her phone. 3:03 a.m. was fast approaching. And then it happened. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, just barely, but enough to make Danica's skin prickle. The tombstones, every single one, shifted. They didn't just slide across the ground, like a trick of the wind. They moved as if something beneath the earth was guiding them, nudging them into new positions. Danica gasped. The camera was rolling, capturing everything. She was witnessing something unbelievable. Leon, who had been checking his phone, froze. "What the hell is that?" Danica's fingers shook as she zoomed in on the shifting stones. She had the footage she needed. But as she zoomed in on one of the tombstones, a new one, standing where there had been nothing just moments before, her heart skipped a beat. The name etched into the stone was hers. Danica Reyes. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. No, that's not possible." Leon rushed over to her side. "What's going on? What did you film?" Danica showed him the camera screen, her face pale. Leon's eyes widened. "What the hell?" They both stared at the screen. The name Danica Reyes was there, carved into the headstone, the letters stark and cold against the dark backdrop of the cemetery. "This doesn't make any sense," Danica said, her voice trembling. We didn't see a headstone like this earlier." Leon, always the rational one, grabbed the camera and tried to rewind the footage, but the playback was distorted. It was as if the camera itself was rejecting the evidence. "You're right. This isn't how it should be." Danica's mind raced. She had caught something on film, a tombstone with her name. But what did it mean? The questions flooded her, one after another. Why her? Why that grave? They didn't have time to answer. The next night, things got worse. At 3:03 a.m. on the dot, Danica went back to Cemetery Row. This time she was determined to understand what was happening. Leon was there again, though he was now unnerved by the strange events that had unfolded. Neither of them spoke much as they walked among the graves, both aware that something far more sinister than they'd expected was at work. And then they saw it. The grave bearing Danica's name was now gone, replaced with a new one. But this time, the name on the stone wasn't hers. It was Leon's. Leon. Oh my God, look at this. Danica's voice shook as she pointed to the grave. Leon went white as he approached it. This isn't funny, Danica. Who's doing this? But Danica wasn't laughing. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't a prank. The cemetery, the tombstones, they were alive in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if the very ground beneath them was feeding off of attention. The more they investigated, the more the cemetery changed. That night, she filmed again, trying to capture whatever force was controlling the tombstones. But as she turned the camera toward the row of graves, she noticed something disturbing. The gravestones weren't just shifting. They were changing, growing, new names etched into each one, names of people she didn't know. And, one by one, as she filmed, she realized the truth. Whoever captured the shift was marked. Danica, Leon said, his voice barely audible. We need to get out of here. But it was too late. The camera was cursed. Each shot they took, each time they focused on the graveyard, the tombstones would move again, reshaping the cemetery into something darker. And now, Danica knew the truth. She wasn't just a witness. She was part of it. The next morning, Danica woke up with a chill running through her body. She went to check her footage, hoping it was all just a nightmare, but the footage on the camera had changed. The names on the stones were no longer random. They were the names of her followers, people who had watched her videos, left comments, and shown interest in her paranormal investigations. They were all marked. I have to stop this, Danica whispered to herself, her hands shaking as she reached for the camera. With a single, desperate motion, she smashed it on the ground, breaking it into pieces. For a moment, there was silence. But as the pieces lay there, the ground trembled again. The cemetery, it seemed, wasn't done with her. As she looked up one, last time she saw hundreds of new headstones all bearing names. Names of people who had followed her, people who had watched her videos, all waiting to be marked. And in the center of it all, Danica saw her name again, fresh and new, etched into the earth. She ran. She ran as fast as she could, but she knew deep down she had already become a part of Cemetery Row. Story number 6. Ava Kinley had always been drawn to the past. While most of her friends were glued to their phones talking about the latest trends and online gossip, Ava found comfort in old books, dusty antiques, and forgotten places. So, when she and her best friend, Jen, discovered the Victorian cemetery tucked at the edge of their small town, Ava couldn't resist the pull to explore it. The cemetery was beautiful in a haunting way, with its crumbling stone statues and aged, moss-covered headstones. Most people avoided it, thinking it too eerie, but to Ava, it felt like stepping into another time. She'd been there a few times before, fascinated by the stories hidden in the weathered stones. But on this particular afternoon, she discovered something new. A row of old graves with small, delicate bells attached to the posts at the head of each plot. Jen rolled her eyes. What's with the bells? Are they supposed to be some sort of creepy decoration? Ava leaned in to inspect one of them. No, look closely. These aren't just for show. Back in the Victorian era, they put bells on graves to stop people from being buried alive. If someone was accidentally buried alive, they could pull the cord to ring the bell, and someone would hear it. Jen shuddered. That's morbid. Ava grinned, always a little too curious for her own good. Yeah, but think of it. Just imagine what kind of stories are behind these graves. Some of these people didn't get a chance to finish their lives. Jen snorted. Yeah, if you believe in that kind of stuff. But you're right, there's probably a lot of weird history here. Ava stepped closer to one of the graves and, without thinking, tugged on the cord that dangled from the bell. The bell rang. Ava froze. It wasn't like the clink of a modern bell. This was different, deep, resonant, as though the sound came from the earth itself. The wind seemed to still, and the temperature dropped sharply. Ava's breath misted in the air as she looked around, her heart pounding. "Okay, that was a little weird," Jen said, voice shaky. "Let's go." But before Ava could respond, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and a figure emerged from the grave. A man, tall and gaunt, his clothes in tatters but unmistakably Victorian. He was pale, his eyes wide with a kind of desperation that made Ava's stomach twist. The man's eyes locked on her, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, he spoke, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. You've come back." Ava's heart raced. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The man reached out toward her with trembling hands, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might touch her. Instead, his fingers brushed the bell cord as if guided by instinct, pulling it once again. The bell rang, the sound now echoing through the graveyard. "Who are you?" Ava managed to choke out. The man's eyes softened, filled with a sadness. That cut deep into Ava's chest. "I am Thomas Worth," he said, his voice trembling. "I was to marry my beloved, but I was robbed. My life was stolen before I could fulfill my promise." Ava shook her head, backing away. This isn't possible, you're dead." Thomas's face contorted in pain. "Dead? No. I cannot be dead. I refuse to be dead. I was buried too soon before I could make things right, before I could be with her." Ava's pulse quickened. She had heard stories about people who died. Tragically, people who couldn't accept their fate, but she never imagined she'd be face to face with one of them. She wanted to run, but her legs felt frozen. You were buried alive?" she whispered. Thomas nodded, his eyes wild with frustration. "They thought I was gone, but I was not. I was not. I awoke in the cold, dark earth, and I cried. I screamed, but no one could hear me. And now—" He looked at Ava, the pain in his gaze morphing into something darker. "Now I have found you." Ava's stomach lurched. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" Thomas took a step forward and Ava instinctively took a step back. "I want you to finish what was taken from me. I want you to live the life I never could. You are her. You are my love. Return to me." Ava's eyes widened in shock. "What? No, I'm not—" "Yes, you are. I see it in your eyes. You are her, the woman I was supposed to marry. The woman I was meant to live and die beside. You will be my bride, as I was always meant to have." Ava shook her head, terrified. "You're wrong. I'm not—" But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. His expression shifted from desperation to something darker. He stepped closer, reaching for her. His cold hands brushed her arm, sending a chill through her body. "You must finish the life I was robbed of," he whispered, his voice low and insistent. "You must live it for me." Ava's mind spun. This couldn't be happening. But as Thomas's cold touch held her in place, she realized with growing horror that something was changing. The ground beneath her felt different, like it was alive, shifting and moving in subtle ways. And there were other bells in the distance, more graves waiting to be disturbed. "Please," she gasped. "I can't help you. I don't know how." Thomas's eyes turned cold, his grip tightening on her arm. "You already have," he said softly, "and now you will finish it." Suddenly, Ava understood. The bells, every bell, every time one was pulled, revived another spirit, another restless soul with unfinished business. Each bell was a tether, a link to a lost life. And now she had been marked. She had pulled the first bell, and now she was tied to the cemetery, bound to its curse. "You can't leave," Thomas whispered, his voice a deadened echo of the man he once was. "You will stay here, forever guarding the bells, just as I am." Ava's heart slammed in her chest. She looked around, seeing the hundreds of gravestones, each with a bell attached, each one with a spirit tied to it, each spirit waiting for their life to be completed. Desperately, she turned to run, but the ground beneath her feet shifted. The bells began to ring, louder and louder, the spirits rising from their graves. Each one was a shadow, a lost soul, calling for completion. And then, Ava realized as the bells continued to toll, she was not running from the cemetery. She was running toward it. She was bound to it, like the others before her. Ava's last scream was swallowed by the night, and the bell rang again. Story number 7. Theo March had always been obsessed with maps. As a cartographer, he saw the world not as a chaotic mass of events and emotions, but as a series of neat lines and ordered spaces. He had OCD, and it didn't help that his need for symmetry and order constantly tugged at him, pulling him deeper into his work. It was comforting. Everything in its place, everything accounted for. But when Theo heard about the cemetery on the edge of town, the one with a perfectly symmetrical layout, his curiosity got the best of him. The cemetery was known for its eerie precision. Each plot was arranged in exact order. The gravestones aligned perfectly, row by row, marker by marker. The townspeople whispered about it, about how no one could ever find Plot 99. The cemetery was old, but everyone agreed that it was too perfect, too symmetrical. People had been buried there for over a century, but there was no record of Plot 99, no name, no date. And every time someone tried to find it, the location of the plot seemed to shift. This intrigued Theo. He decided to map it, to find the source of the mystery. Maybe it was just an error, a missing piece in a century-old puzzle. Maybe the cemetery's symmetry was just a trick of the eye, an optical illusion, or some mistake made long ago. Theo's brother Benji had warned him against it. "You're getting obsessed, Theo. You've always been obsessed with order, but this place, this cemetery, it's not normal. I can feel it. Something's wrong." But Theo couldn't stop. He had to know. He had to find Plot 99. He went to the cemetery every day for weeks, walking the rows, his mind swirling with thoughts of symmetry, of the impossible perfectness of the place. He marked down every stone, every corner, every row. But no matter how precise he was, no matter how closely he studied the land, Plot 99 wasn't there. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the graves, Theo noticed something strange. The stones weren't just lined up, they moved. A grave that had been in one place in the morning was now several yards to the left. A tombstone that had once been upright was now tilted at an odd angle. His heart raced as he realized what was happening. The cemetery was shifting. Theo's first instinct was to run, but his obsessive nature wouldn't let him. He had to see it through. He had to understand. The symmetry, the perfect order, it had to mean something. There had to be an explanation. So, Theo pushed forward, ignoring the growing unease in his stomach. Then, one evening, as he turned a corner in the cemetery, he saw it. Plot 99. It wasn't marked, it didn't have a name or a date, but Theo could feel it. He could feel that something was wrong. He stood there, staring at the empty patch. of ground where the grave should be. It was perfectly placed, perfectly situated, but it was also shifting. He stepped closer to examine it, and then everything changed. A sharp pain shot through his chest and the world around him blurred. He collapsed, gasping for breath. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and then, as if from nowhere, he was suddenly in a different place. The cemetery, the entire cemetery, was gone. He was back in his apartment. His hands were shaking, his heart racing. Everything felt wrong. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m. He hadn't remembered falling asleep. But then the doorbell rang. It was Benji, standing on his doorstep. He looked pale, as if he hadn't slept in days. You were at the cemetery," Benji said, his voice hollow. "Theo, you went missing. You've been gone for hours." Theo blinked, confused. "What do you mean? Benji cut him off. "You went to the cemetery to find plot 99, but when we went there, you weren't anywhere. I searched for you. We couldn't find you. I thought you were dead." Theo felt his blood run cold. He hadn't been at the cemetery for hours. He had only just left. But the look on Benji's face told him something was terribly wrong. Confused and terrified, Theo ran back to the cemetery the next day. But when he arrived, it was just as it had been before. Perfectly symmetrical. No sign of his disappearance. No sign of the pain. No sign of the world shifting. And yet, something felt different. He found plot 99 again, and this time, he made a decision. He pulled out his map, trying to mark the spot. But as he traced the lines on his paper, everything blurred. And once again, the world around him dissolved into nothingness. Theo collapsed, and when he opened his eyes, he was back at the cemetery again. He'd been here before. He had been here many times before. Each time he died, each time he tried to understand, he ended up at plot 99. The graveyard wasn't just shifting. It was a temporal anchor, a place where time looped in on itself. Every death he witnessed, every mistake he made, every attempt to break free led him right back to the same spot. The cemetery, it seemed, wasn't just alive. It was a paradox, a living loop that fed on those who sought its secrets. Each death, each life cut short, kept the loop going. Theo tried to map the cemetery. He tried to break the loop. He tried everything he could think of, but the timeline always reset, always bringing him back to the same grave, the same question. One day, after years of dying and returning, Theo realized something. He could break the loop if he sacrificed himself. If he closed the loop, he could end it. He could stop the never-ending cycle of death. So, Theo made a choice. He mapped the loop, charting every shift, every turn, every moment. And in his final act, he drew a line that connected everything. He sacrificed himself, stepping into plot 99. The cemetery fell silent, but when the ground settled, when Theo's body had vanished, a new grave appeared at the far end of the cemetery. Plot 100, and the loop, it seemed, was never really broken. Story number 8. It was supposed to be a joke, just a Halloween prank to spice up the night. Ella Park had never been one for trouble, but her friends Jake, Lila, and Marcus had always pushed her into things she didn't quite agree with. They were a group of pranksters, always looking for the next laugh, the next thrill, and this Halloween, they had the perfect plan. They'd heard about an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, a spooky, forgotten place with gravestones that were weathered and cracked, a perfect place for a midnight dare. Jake had found an old tombstone lying alone at the farthest corner of the cemetery, half buried under moss and vines. "This'll be perfect," he'd said, grinning. "Just think about it, a real tombstone. We steal it, haul it back, and take a picture. It'll be hilarious." Lila and Marcus were all for it, but Ella, ever the voice of caution, hesitated. "Are you sure this is a good idea? What if—" "Come on, Ella," Jake cut in. "It's just a dumb prank. We're not hurting anyone. Besides, it's Halloween. This is what we do." So, against her better judgment, Ella agreed to go along with it. They pulled the stone out of the ground with some effort, laughing as they dragged it back to Jake's house. It wasn't an easy task. Tombstones were heavy, and this one was old, the kind that felt like it had been part of the earth for centuries. The engraving was faded, but still readable. It said, "Here lies Thomas Thorne, who carved his soul into stone. May he rest in peace or not, for his work was never done." The inscription sent a chill through Ella's spine, but she shrugged it off. It was just an old, spooky engraving. Nothing more. That night, after a few beers and a lot of jokes, the group set the tombstone upright in Jake's backyard. They posed for pictures, laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, but the laughter quickly faded when the clock struck midnight. That's when things began to go wrong. Jake was the first to go. He was the loudest, the most daring, always looking for the next adrenaline rush. He'd been the one to pull the tombstone from the cemetery after all. But the next morning, he was found, his body twisted in an unnatural way, his face frozen in terror. His neck had been snapped, and the worst part? The inscription on the tombstone had changed. "Here lies Thomas Thorne, who carved his soul into stone. May he rest in peace or not, for his work was never done. And now lies Jake Harris, whose neck met its end too soon." Ella's stomach turned when she saw the new words. It felt wrong, but it was just a coincidence, right? Just a prank gone bad. But when Lila died the next day, the same thing happened. She was found in a pool of blood, the back of her head crushed, the tombstone now reading, "Here lies Thomas Thorne, who carved his soul into stone. May he rest in peace or not, for his work was never done. And now lies Jake Harris, whose neck met its end too soon, and Lila West, whose skull was crushed under fate's cruel hand." Each death seemed eerily connected to the epitaph. It was like the tombstone was writing the deaths, adding to the curse with every soul it claimed. Marcus, desperate to leave the cursed stone behind, tried to burn it, but when he touched it, the flames died out and his body was found, strangled with a rope that seemed to appear from nowhere. The tombstone had grown again. "Here lies Thomas Thorne, who carved his soul into stone. May he rest in peace or not, for his work was never done. And now lies Jake Harris, whose neck met its end too soon, and Lila West, whose skull was crushed under fate's cruel hand, and Marcus Bell, whose breath was stolen by unseen hands." Now, only Ella remained. She couldn't understand what was happening. She'd been the one who didn't want to steal the tombstone. She hadn't wanted any part of it. But here she was, the last one left. She stared at the stone, at the cursed inscription that seemed to mock her. She had to return it. She had to stop whatever was happening, or else she would be next. The tombstone's curse was tied to the grave it had come from, and if she didn't return it before midnight, she would become part of the inscription. With trembling hands, Ella grabbed the stone and ran back to the cemetery. She didn't know how or why, but she knew she had to get it back, or she would be the next name carved into the stone. As she approached the cemetery, the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The trees seemed to close in, as if the whole place was watching her, waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest, each breath a struggle. Ella reached the spot where they'd dug up the tombstone, and her eyes widened when she saw the grave. The earth was disturbed, and there, waiting for her, was the grave of Thomas Thorne. His name, once again, was perfectly carved into the stone. But there was something different about it now. Here lies Thomas Thorne, who carved his soul into stone. May he rest in peace or not, for his work was never done. And now lies Jake Harris, whose neck met its end too soon, and Lila West, whose skull was crushed under fate's cruel hand, and Marcus Bell, whose breath was stolen by unseen hands, and Ella Park, whose fate was sealed by a pact of stone. She gasped, staring at the fresh inscription. Her name was already there, already etched into the stone. She had failed. Ella shoved the tombstone into the grave, desperate to escape the inevitable. But as the clock struck midnight, she felt a cold hand grasp her heart. Her vision blurred, and the world spun around her. She was falling into a dark abyss. When she woke up, everything was silent. The cemetery was empty. But the tombstone was there, standing once again. And as Ella looked down at it, she saw her name, carved deep into the stone, just as it had been before. She had become part of the curse. The epitaph was no longer just a warning. It was a truth. And tomorrow, the stone would claim its next victim. Story number 9. Miles. Conrad hadn't felt at peace since his mother died. It had been 3 months, but it still felt fresh, like the wound was barely covered. He missed her every day, even in the smallest things. Her laugh, her smell, the way she'd always make him feel better when the world felt like it was falling apart. Now, there was nothing but silence. It didn't help that their small town of Black Hollow had a reputation for oddities. The cemetery, on the edge of town where his mother was buried, was one of those strange places. Built on top of an old, dried-up well, the graveyard had always given Miles a bad feeling. The well had been forgotten, sealed over long ago, but people still said the ground was cursed. No one ever lingered there. But the heavy rains had started again, and with them, something changed. It started softly at first, faint murmurs from below the ground. Miles had noticed it one evening while he was visiting his mother's grave. The air had turned thick and heavy, and he thought he heard whispers, but when he turned around, no one was there. He thought it was just his grief playing tricks on him. That night, the whispers grew louder. The next morning, the whole town was talking about it. People had heard it too. Voices, soft and mournful, like they were coming from the earth itself. Some of the older folks said it was the sound of the dead calling out from beyond. Others said it was the well. Something had awakened inside it, something ancient. And as the rains continued to fall, the voices only grew louder, more distinct. People started hearing the voices of their loved ones, those who had passed years ago, calling them from the ground. It was comforting at first, like a reunion with the lost. But the longer it went on, the more unnatural it felt. The voices sounded pleading, desperate. Miles wasn't sure what he was expecting when he heard his mother's voice. He was walking through the cemetery again, his heart heavy with grief, when it happened. He stopped in front of her grave, staring at the fresh flowers he'd brought when he heard it. Her voice. Miles. My sweet boy. It was soft at first, like a whisper on the wind, but unmistakable. He froze. Miles, I'm still here. Come to me. Please. His heart leaped in his chest. It sounded like his mother, but it couldn't be. She was gone. But the voice, it felt so real. He had to answer. He needed to know if she was really there. Mom, he called, his voice trembling. Come to me, Miles. I need you here with me. It's so cold, but I'm not alone. We'll be together forever." The sound of her voice was so comforting, so familiar. It wrapped around him like a blanket, soothing the ache inside him. He stepped closer to her grave, the earth soft beneath his feet, and he reached for the ground. But then, he felt it. The ground beneath his feet gave way, and with a sudden rush, he was falling, tumbling down into the earth, into the darkness, below. The air grew colder, the whispers growing louder, all around him. They were voices now, hundreds, thousands, all calling out at once, but none of them were his mother's. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The earth swallowed him, pulling him deeper and deeper into a vast, watery void. When he finally landed, he was submerged in water. It was dark, thick, and suffocating. He tried to push up, but the water kept pulling him down. Through the darkness, he saw shapes, figures drifting in the water. He recognized some of them. Old friends, neighbors, family members. Their eyes were wide, staring, but they couldn't speak. Their mouths moved, but the words didn't reach him. Then he saw her, his mother, her pale face floating just above the water's surface, her eyes wide with desperation. She was reaching for him, her arms outstretched, pleading. "Miles, you came back. Stay with me, please. It's so cold here. I'm all alone, and I don't want to be alone anymore." The water seemed to pulse around him, as if it were alive, alive with grief, with sorrow. He felt a sudden pressure in his chest, like the weight of 1,000 lost souls pushing him down. The voices, now shrill and panicked, grew louder. They were feeding off his sorrow, drawing him deeper into the void. "Please, Miles, stay. You don't have to leave. We can be together here, forever." His mother's voice was so sweet, so desperate it almost felt like a relief. But then he remembered. He remembered what had happened. His mother had died in an accident. He had been there when it happened. And now she was trapped here, feeding the well's hunger, trapped with all the others. The truth hit him like a slap in the face. These weren't his mother's words. This wasn't a reunion. These were the voices of the well's spirits, ancient water-based entities that fed on grief. They weren't calling for him because they loved him. They wanted him to stay. They wanted to drag him down, to feed off his pain, to turn him into one of them. "Miles, you have to leave." A voice broke through the water, sharp and clear. It was Lena, his best friend. She had been looking for him. "Miles, you have to fight it." He grabbed the edge of the water, pulling himself toward the surface. His body ached, his mind clouded with grief, but he pushed forward. His mother's voice called to him again, softer now, more pleading, but it was too late. Miles had made his choice. He broke through the surface, gasping for air, his heart racing. He was back in the cemetery, drenched and cold, his feet still sinking into the mud. The voices faded, but his mother's voice lingered in his mind, faint, but still calling. "Miles, please." Miles ran, his legs heavy, his chest tight, the sounds of the well's whispers fading behind him. He didn't stop until he was home, until he was safe, but he wasn't the same. Not anymore. That night, after he fell asleep, the sound of water filled his ears. He awoke with a start, panic rising in his chest. The basement. He heard water splashing in the basement. He rushed downstairs, his heart pounding, but when he opened the door, all he found was darkness. And then the water started to bubble up from the floor. The whispers were coming back. Story number 10. Nolan Fry had never expected much from life. As a boy, he'd played among the headstones of the small cemetery at the edge of town, where his father had worked as the caretaker for as long as Nolan could remember. The old stone mausoleums, weathered and cracked, had been his playground, their inscriptions a kind of secret code only he understood. The people buried there were long gone, their stories fading into the past, but to Nolan, it all felt like a quiet, peaceful rhythm. He found comfort in the silence of the graveyard, a world far removed from the hustle of life. But when his father passed, Nolan was left to tend the cemetery alone. It wasn't much, but it was familiar. The old caretaker's cottage had always been home, and the job was simple. Pull the weeds, trim the grass, clean the gravestones, that was all. Then, one day, a letter came. It was addressed to Nolan, but the envelope was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, a legal document informed him that, as the closest living relative of his late uncle, he had inherited the old manor at the edge of the cemetery. Nolan's first thought was to ignore it. He had no real connection to his uncle, a reclusive man who'd lived a lonely life. But the letter insisted, and out of curiosity more than anything, Nolan decided to see the place for himself. The manor was as grand as it was unsettling. Its windows stared like dark eyes, and the ivy that clung to the stone walls looked almost alive, as though it was trying to crawl inside. When Nolan stepped inside, a cold gust of air greeted him, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. The house seemed to breathe, groaning under its own weight. The heavy smell of dust and decay filled the air. At first glance, it seemed like any other old house. But as he explored, Nolan began to notice something strange. The manor was unlike anything he had ever seen. The rooms didn't just feel old. They felt alive. They had a quality that was unsettling, like they were waiting for something. Each room was like a snapshot of a different time period, some familiar, some completely foreign. The parlor looked like it belonged to the Victorian era, with its velvet, furniture, and gas lamps. The dining room was set as though a meal had just been served, with silverware and china placed meticulously on the table, though no one had touched it for years. And the further Nolan went, the more he realized that each room wasn't just a relic of the past. It was connected to the people buried in the cemetery. One night, while wandering through the manor, Nolan opened a door to what looked like a bedroom, only to find himself standing in the midst of a violent scene. A woman, her face frozen in terror, lay in bed. A man stood over her, holding a knife, his expression twisted in rage. It was a murder scene, a moment of death captured in time. Nolan felt an odd pressure in his chest as if the room itself was pulling him in, urging him to take part in the scene, to play the role of a victim or a witness. He backed away, his heart racing, but as he stepped back into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind him. Nolan didn't know what he had seen, but he knew one thing. The manor wasn't just a house. It was something else, a trap built on trauma, a house that fed on death and memory. The next day, Nolan went into the library searching for answers. As he rifled through the dusty bookshelves, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was an old man, dressed in the clothes of a long-dead caretaker. His eyes were empty like hollow sockets, but they fixed on Nolan with an unsettling intensity. "You found it, haven't you?" the man said, his voice soft but full of dread. "Found what?" Nolan asked, his throat tight. "The house," the old man replied, stepping forward. "It's not just a house, it's a prison, a reflection of the lives that were taken here. It's built on their grief and pain, and now you've inherited it." Nolan felt a wave of unease wash over him. "What do you mean?" "I was the caretaker before you," the old man said. "I watched the rooms change, heard the screams, felt the pull of each death. I never escaped, and neither will you." The man's words gnawed at Nolan's mind, but before he could ask more, the old man faded, disappearing into the air like smoke. Later that evening, Nolan heard the whispering voices again, soft murmurs coming from behind one of the doors. He approached the source and slowly turned the handle. Inside was a room unlike any he had seen before. It was a hallway lined with mirrors. The reflection in each mirror showed a different scene, a different death, all connected to the cemetery outside. There were drownings, poisonings, accidents, murders. Each mirror held a scene of someone's last moments. But when Nolan looked at one of the mirrors, he didn't see a stranger. He saw himself. In the reflection, Nolan was lying on the floor of the manor, blood pooling around him, his eyes wide in terror. The scene was blurry, but it was unmistakable. He was seeing his own death. Panic surged through him as he slammed the door shut, but it was too late. The manor had already claimed him. The rooms began to shift, pulling him into their stories. Every time Nolan entered a new room, he was forced to reenact a death, becoming part of the tragedy that had unfolded there. He tried to escape, but each door led him further into the house, deeper into the trap. The house fed on his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. And as time passed, Nolan could feel himself changing. The more he became a part of the deaths, the more the house seemed to claim him. His reflections in the mirrors became distorted, flickering between his true self and something else. Something dead. In the final room, Nolan saw it, the scene of his death again. But this time it was different. The future was already written. He was lying on the floor, blood soaking into the floorboards, the manor's walls closing in on him. He couldn't stay. He had to get out. With all his strength, Nolan raced to the front door. He wrenched it open, his heart pounding in his chest, but the house seemed to fight him every step of the way. The floors groaned, the walls shook, and he felt the weight of all the souls, trapped inside, pressing down on him. But somehow, he broke free. Nolan stumbled outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The manor stood behind him, dark and silent, as though nothing had ever happened. It seemed to be waiting, watching, but the house didn't chase him. Not yet. But as Nolan turned to leave, he saw it. His name, etched into a fresh headstone just outside the cemetery gates. It was his grave, the one he had been running from. The house hadn't let him go. It had only let him escape for now, and as the wind howled through the cemetery, Nolan knew he would never be free. The manor was still watching, waiting for him to return. Don't just watch. Dare to feel the terror. Share this video with your friends who love a good scare and tell us which of these creepy tales had you sleeping with the lights on. Have you ever experienced anything strange in a cemetery or old house? Share your eerie encounters in the comments below.